Thanks to everyone for tuning in to our webinar series on fire retardancy. My name is Haskell Beckham, and I'll be serving as your moderator and host today. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to tell you a little about our webinar series. This webinar series originally grew out of member requests to the staff at the Industrial Fabrics Association. The topical outline shown here on the left was developed based on questions and feedback received from members. Beginning last August, we initiated a series of webinars held approximately every 2 months and have been working our way through the outline. Today, we're pleased to present our 6th and final webinar in the series with an overview of environmental and regulatory considerations of flame retardants. With this, we will have completed the topical outline, and therefore this is the last planned webinar in the series. We're planning a wrap-up and summary of the series at the Fall IFAI Expo in Charlotte, in which we'll summarize and review the highlights of the webinar series with a focus on what we've learned. Hope you'll be able to join us in Charlotte in October for that. Let me introduce our speakers today. Kristen Robrock is an environmental engineer and microbiologist who specializes in biodegradation and the fate and transport of chemicals in the environment. Her expertise is on emerging chemicals, including flame retardants. She has extensive experience working with chlorinated solvents, metals, and hydrocarbons in soil and groundwater. Dr. Robrock works largely on environmental forensics cases, determining timing and locating sources of contaminant release, quantifying contaminant releases, conducting historical site reconstructions, and identifying other potential sources of contamination. She provides technical consulting on effectiveness of remediation activities and costs, and she's also a California licensed engineer. Chris is going to be joined today by Mark Duvall. Mark is a principal with the environmental law firm Beveridge and Diamond in its Washington, D.C. office. He heads the firm's chemicals practice. He focuses principally on federal regulation of chemicals and products by EPA under the Toxic Substances Control Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act by the Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Food and Drug Administration, and by states. He also works actively on green chemistry, green marketing, and OSHA matters. Please note that if you have a question during the webinar, please enter it on the GoToWebinar toolbar. We will address the questions at the end of the presentation. Kristen's going to go first, so I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, and when she's done, she'll turn it over to Mark. Kristen, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you, Haskell, for the introduction, and thank you to the Industrial Fabrics Association for this opportunity. Our presentation today will have 2 main topics. First, I will discuss technical environmental issues concerning flame retardants, and then secondly, Mark will discuss regulatory issues. With respect to the environmental issues, I will cover the major environmental concerns with flame retardants, how they get out into the environment, the concentrations at which we detect them, and then some of the assessment work that the EPA has been conducting. Mark will then discuss regulatory issues and, importantly, the new Toxic Substances Control Act, which should be signed into law any day now. He'll also discuss significant new use rules and other flammability standards from the Consumer Product Safety Commission and other states. So flame retardants have been in the use for several years now. You may have seen some of these articles. But in addition to the media attention, flame retardants are also undergoing a lot of scrutiny from regulatory agencies, such as the US EPA, as well as certain states like California. So one of the goals of this webinar is to give you a sense of some of the environmental issues surrounding flame retardants, and generally to understand why there is so much concern and scrutiny going on. But also, I should mention that there are dozens or even hundreds of different flame retardants, and only some of them have been getting bad press. So what I'm hoping you can take away for this webinar is which flame retardants are of most environmental concern and being scrutinized more closely, and so that you can make a more informed choice as you select a flame retardant for use. I should also mention that Given the audience of this webinar, our main focus is going to be on the flame retardants used in textiles. So the main concerns with flame retardants are obviously their potential impacts to human and ecological health, and those obviously differ by each individual flame retardant. Some are greater than others, as we will discuss later in this presentation. But part of the problem that can exacerbate human and ecological health impacts is the fact that many of these flame retardants are persistent. In other words, they do not degrade in the environment. And this persistence is due to the design of these compounds. So flame retardants are designed to be stable and to not break down in the product itself over time, so that if and when a fire does occur, they can still be effective. But this persistence is, in essence, a double-edged sword, because we'd like these compounds to be stable in the product, but we'd like them to degrade in the environment. Obviously, chemistry just doesn't permit that. And so they do tend to persist for a long time. Some of them also tend to bioaccumulate. Typically, these are the flame retardants that are hydrophobic, those that do not like water. And so they can accumulate at higher concentrations in humans or in animal tissue. And so the combination of the persistence and the bioaccumulation means that flame retardants can work their way up the food chain, and they can also migrate very long distances to remote areas around the world. In fact, there's been a lot of concern that certain flame retardants, such as PBDEs or HBCD, have been detected in polar bear tissue in areas of the Arctic that are far removed from human civilization. So I'd also like to stress, even though I'm making some general statements about flame retardant behavior, the specific behavior of each flame retardant is really dependent on its specific chemistry. And so each one should be looked at closely on its own. So with respect to the human health concerns, the main concerns of issue to the EPA are kind of the classical issues of carcinogenicity and mutagenicity and neurotoxicity. And more recently, the EPA has been looking at impacts to reproductive toxicity or developmental toxicity, and also endocrine disruption, which is where a flame retardant can mimic a hormone and impact our hormonal balance in our bodies. With respect to ecological health, the items of concern are acute and chronic aquatic toxicity. So as I mentioned before, many flame retardants are persistent and resist degradation once they are released to the environment. So the EPA has estimated environmental half-lives for many flame retardants, and this graph right here provides a summary of some of the selected flame retardants that are used in textiles. And the bars represent the EPA's estimated environmental half-life on the order of days. So these half-lives were created based on all potential degradation mechanisms and are a combination of all of those. As you can see, all of these compounds have half-lives greater than 60 days, and most of them are on the order of 180 days or 6 months. It should also be noted that many of these half-lives are a lower bound, in that the EPA estimated that the half-life to be at least 180 days, because there's not a lot of certainty sometimes in these particular numbers. And so also to remember, because this is a half-life, to remove most or 99% of a given compound, you need about 6 half-lives. And so if you're looking at a half-life of 180 days, you really need about 3 years to remove the vast majority of the compound from the environment. So I mentioned earlier that some flame retardants tend to bioaccumulate in humans and biota. The flame retardants that do this are hydrophobic. So in other words, they don't like water, and they tend to accumulate in the fats present in our bodies. And the flame retardants PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers, are a good example of this. And we have a lot of data for these particular compounds. So this graph shows the trend over time of PBD concentrations detected in human blood starting in the 1970s through the present. And for reference, the bioconcentration factors for PBDEs range from, because there's a whole family of them, They range from 100 to 100,000, meaning that the concentration in an organism will be 100 to 100,000 times greater than the concentration in the environment. And so because of their ability to bioaccumulate in their long half-lives in the human body, PBD concentrations increased exponentially over the decades. The vertical scale bar here is logarithmic, and so this linear trend is ultimately exponential. And ultimately, because of environmental concerns and increasing human concentrations, PBDEs were banned in selected states or voluntarily withdrawn from the market starting in 2004. And a recent study just 6 years later found that PBD concentrations decreased by an order of magnitude. So this indicates that once the exposure is reduced, the concentrations do decrease. So there are multiple ways in which flame retardants can be released from products and get out into the environment. The flame retardants that are most volatile can volatilize directly from products into the air. Those that are less volatile can adhere to dust that has deposited on the surface of the product. Or also you can get small fragments of the product itself that break off and become dust particles. In fact, dust is believed to be the major exposure route of flame retardants to humans. And this is different from our more historical chemicals of concern, the more traditional ones such as PCBs, to which we're exposed mostly through food. So flame retardants that are hydrophilic, meaning that they like water, can dissolve from a product and be released during washing or laundry. And lastly, flame retardants can also be released during disposal if they are ground up during waste processing or incinerated, or they may also leach from products into landfills. So really the specific mechanism of release for a given flame retardant really depends on the physical and chemical properties of that specific flame retardant and the matrix in which it's contained. These two graphs at the bottom of the slide show some general trends that we see with phosphate-based flame retardants based on size. So on the left-hand side, we see that the larger phosphate-based flame retardants tend to be less soluble as they get bigger or heavier. And on the right-hand side, the slide shows that phosphate-based flame retardants tend to absorb more as they get bigger and heavier. This is the log KOW, which is the partition coefficient between octanol, which is a representative for fat, and water. So I mentioned earlier that flame retardants can volatilize from products. The rate at which they do so depends on the vapor pressure of the flame retardant itself, but also it depends on the matrix in which the flame retardant is embedded. So the table on the left presents some emission rates measured during a number of studies. And as you can see, the rate varies tremendously based on the flame retardant. So HBCD from a polyester curtain is released at a rate 100 times greater than PBDEs from a polyester curtain. But you can also see that TCPP is much more readily released from an upholstered stool compared to TCPP in a mattress. On the right, there's a graph that shows the impact that a textile covering can have. The open circles on the left of the graph show the emission rate over time, so the TCPP concentration in air, and that is from a foam treated with TCPP, whereas the black squares show the emission rate in a TCPP treated foam that has been covered with a textile. So ultimately, the matrix in which the flame retardant is contained is really important to its behavior. Flame retardants can also absorb to dust, and also tiny fragments of products can also become dust particles themselves. So this image is an electron micrograph of a dust particle. As you can see in red, that's the body of the dust particle. And the areas in green are areas that have high bromine content, and these are representing brominated flame retardants. And so you can see that there are brominated flame retardants dispersed throughout this dust particle. We don't know whether these are absorbed brominated flame retardants or pieces of product that contained a brominated flame retardant, but ultimately this illustrates one of the major release pathways for flame retardants. The more soluble flame retardants can dissolve into water when they are washed or laundered. Many of the phosphate-based flame retardants are rather soluble and can follow this release pathway. Water used during washing ends up at sewage treatment plants, and the processes that occur in the sewage treatment plant don't always completely degrade or even partially degrade the flame retardants, and thus they can pass directly through the sewage treatment. And the treated effluent is often released to rivers or lakes, which can be used as a drinking water source for a downstream drinking water treatment plant. And so thus, the flame retardants can enter this cycle of water reuse. A recent study from the U.S. Geological Survey detected TCEP and TDCPP in effluent from 9 wastewater treatment plants discharging into the Columbia River. Flame retardants that are more hydrophobic, that enter into the sewage treatment pathway, can absorb to particles in the treatment process itself, and those particles are often removed as part of the biosolids, which are removed from wastewater treatment plants. Biosolids are often spread on land, such as agricultural fields, and so flame retardants embedded in biosolids can also enter the agricultural food chain. A recent study detected a number of flame retardants, including TBB and TBPH, in biosolids. So in summary, flame retardants are released from products by volatilizing into the air. They can absorb to dust particles, which can also be transported into the air and ultimately deposited into soils. They dissolve into water during washing, and wastewater treatment plants can then transport them into rivers or lakes or the ocean, or wastewater treatment plants can transport them via biosolids into the soil. More hydrophobic flame retardants, once they are out in the environment, can then migrate from air or water and soils into biota and bioaccumulate and then migrate up the food chain. So through these various environmental transport processes, and because of their persistence, certain flame retardants such as HBCD have been able to migrate from consumer products all the way into polar bears located in the Arctic far from civilization. So once flame retardants are released into the environment, there are 3 major degradation mechanisms. There's photodegradation, microbial or abiotic degradation, and hydrolysis. And the particular degradation mechanism which can affect a given flame retardant is highly dependent on the chemistry of the flame retardant itself. So photodegradation is the degradation that occurs in the presence of light, typically ultraviolet light. And brominated flame retardants are particularly subject to this degradation mechanism, and that's due to the nature of the carbon-bromine bond, which likes to fall apart in the presence of UV light. These reactions typically occur quickly, on the order of hours or days. I should note that this mechanism can also occur to the flame retardants in a product if exposed to sunlight. Microbial or abiotic degradation is degradation that occurs once a product is released into soils or water, where microorganisms or other chemicals present in the water or soils can attack the flame retardant. These processes tend to be slow and occur on the order of days or years. Ammonium polyphosphate is an example of a flame retardant which biodegrades readily. Finally, the third method is hydrolysis, which is degradation that occurs when water reacts with the flame retardant itself, as happens with zinc borate. This can also occur to certain flame retardants while they are still in the product. Hydrolysis also tends to be fairly fast, occurring on the order of days. And it should be noted that although a flame retardant may degrade, it may not degrade completely, in that it may not degrade completely to carbon dioxide and water, but it actually may be transformed into a different compound, which may have its own toxicity issues. So really, degradation mechanisms and pathways in the ultimate end products are important aspects to consider. So this graph that I put together represents the range of concentrations that we detect in air, in household dust, in sewage sludge, in human blood for 3 representative flame retardants for HBCD, TBPH, and TDCPP. And please note that the y-axis is logarithmic. So what is evident from this graph is that there's an enormous range in concentrations, easily spanning 5 orders of magnitude, as you can see with HBCD in household dust. And the reason we see this tremendous variability is because it really depends on exactly whose house or office you sample and which specific products are being used in that house or office. And so ultimately, the exposures to flame retardants can vary tremendously. I should note I have a couple of question marks here. One is for TBPH in indoor air, and that's because I couldn't find any data for indoor air for that particular compound. And for TDCPP in human blood, that's due to the fact that this compound tends to be a little more soluble, and so it actually is detected more in urine than in blood. And so a lot of the data are for urine, not lipids in blood. So after I presented that tremendous range in concentrations that are detected in the environment, the next obvious question is whether these concentrations exceed any thresholds. So the U.S. EPA has prepared what are called regional screening levels for a number of compounds, and there are a few flame retardants on that list, including TDCPP, TCEP, PBDEs, antimony trioxide, and ammonium polyphosphate. So these regional screening levels were developed using risk assessment guidance from the EPA Superfund program. And I should stress that they are not cleanup standards, but rather they're screening levels for comparison to understand whether a site is clean or whether a further assessment is needed. And so this table compares the available screening levels for TDCPP and TCEP for tap water with the range of concentrations that we find in surface water. And so obviously surface water is not the same as tap water, and since tap water undergoes drinking water treatment, but this is the closest possible comparison. Other screening levels are for soil or groundwater, which obviously doesn't compare here. So as you can see, the range of environmental concentrations is significantly below the screening levels, would suggest that risk is minimal or there's no risk. But the difference is only an order of magnitude for TCEP. So unfortunately, other flame retardants for which regional screening levels exist, such as antimony trioxide or ammonium polyphosphate, I couldn't find good surface water concentrations for those in order to do a comparison. So moving on to the EPA assessments, the EPA has recently completed 4 assessments of flame retardants in consumer products, specifically one of DecaBDE, one for HBCD, one for flame retardants in flexible polyurethane foams, and one for flame retardants in circuit boards. And the purpose of these assessments was to provide human and ecological hazard information as a first step in comparing flame retardants that could be used in a given product. And the EPA specifically provides hazard ratings for human health effects, aquatic toxicity, and environmental fate. And although these reports, they don't compare cost and efficacy, but they do provide a great summary of all the available environmental information that the EPA reviewed in preparing these hazard assessments. And they're an excellent starting point for getting a sense of how a particular flame retardant will behave in the environment and the potential impacts to human and biota. I should mention that these assessments are not based on the use of a particular flame retardant in a particular product, say a flame retardant embedded in a textile matrix, but they're just based on the pure flame retardant itself. But based on these hazard ratings assigned by the EPA, you can get a general idea of which flame retardants have greater hazards associated with them and which might be subject to more scrutiny in the future. So in this table, what I have done is to try to very briefly summarize the EPA's hazard assessment for a number of flame retardants used in textiles. This table is in no way meant to be exhaustive, and it also very much simplifies the original EPA tables, which contain a lot more information. For each one of these categories, human health and aquatic toxicity and environmental fate, the EPA provides many, many subcategories within that and many, many sub-ratings within that. But what I've tried to do here is just to give you a sense of what the hazards are in the general magnitude. And the hazard rating I list here is the highest hazard rating reported for each category. And on the right, I list the specific category behind the highest rating. And I also added the color codings. So what you can see here is that while human health and aquatic toxicity ratings vary from flame retardant to flame retardant, and they go from low to medium to high to very high, the environmental fate hazard on the right is almost consistently high or very high. And that is usually due to the environmental persistence as listed on the far right-hand column. And I mentioned earlier that this persistence is a double-edged sword because it's important for these flame retardants to be stable during product use so they can continue to be effective, but this also means that they're resistant to degradation once they are released. So here is the second page of the table that I've assembled. The first page focused on the halogenated flame retardants. These are the phosphate-based and inorganic flame retardants. And again, this is just a brief summary, so please go to the original EPA assessments if you need additional details or information on a given flame retardant. So on the other side of the Atlantic, the European Chemical Agency, which is part of the European Union, they also have a website dedicated to listing the environmental hazards associated with various chemicals. And I've prepared this table which lists the various hazards reported in this database for the same flame retardants used in textiles that I would listed in the previous table on the EPA assessment. And the information in the database was submitted by manufacturers as part of the REACH registration process. And I've just highlighted in red areas where there is information. In some cases, we have no information, or in some cases, no hazards have been classified. What's a little unfortunate is that sometimes the information in this database differs from what is in the EPA assessments. For example, for bromobenzyl acrylate, the EU says that it may cause long-lasting effects to aquatic health, but if we look at the EPA assessment, it's listed as having low aquatic toxicity. So there's a little bit of discrepancy, and that would need to potentially be digged into if that's a flame retardant of interest. But at least we have some hazard information from the European Union to fill out an assessment process. Again, here is a second page of the table focusing on the phosphate-based flame retardants and the inorganic flame retardants. I would also like to mention that the European Chemical Agency has listed some of these flame retardants as substances of very high concern, and their use may ultimately be restricted. Those are specifically HBCD, DecaBDE, TCEP, and short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which are included on this list. So getting back to the United States, the EPA, under the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, which Mark will discuss much more in length, The EPA is conducting more refined assessments of a select number of flame retardants, which are shown in this slide right here. And specifically, these assessments look at a given chemical in a specific use setting, such as the chlorinated phosphate esters, that's here in the middle, TCEP, TCPP, and DDCPP in furniture, foams, and textiles. The only work plan assessment that has been completed to date is the one for antimony trioxide on the right-hand side, used as a synergist with other halogenated flame retardants. And this assessment specifically looked at the ecological impacts, since the human impacts were determined by the EPA to be minor. So we're still waiting for the results of these other TSCA work plan assessments. But from this graph, you can get a sense here of which flame retardants are being scrutinized more closely by the EPA. And with that, I will pass this over to Mark, who will discuss regulatory considerations.
Well, thank you very much, Kristen. So the Toxic Substances Control Act is the primary federal law regulating chemicals in the United States, other than pesticides regulated under FIFRA and FDA-regulated materials. The Obama administration, starting in 2009, very early in the administration, has shown significant interest in flame retardants. It started off early with a chemical action plan for PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and for which it had, in around 2006, promulgated a significant new use rule for penta and octa BDE. This chemical action plan looked to the use of those two flame retardants in articles, as well as all uses of deca BDE. It issued an alternatives assessment on alternatives to PBDEs, and it issued a proposed significant new use rule for PBDEs in April of 2012. In that proposed rule, it proposed to waive the usual exemption for articles, chemicals that are in articles, meaning that once finalized, the SNR would apply to all articles containing any PBDEs. That primarily impacts importers. The domestic suppliers of these chemicals have pretty much stopped making them, but my understanding is that there continue to be imports of products containing PBDEs, particularly DECA. Of interest is that after a lot of comments and objections to that proposed SNR, EPA has not finalized it in the 4 years since it came out, and then for the last year and a half, there's not even mentioned this SNR in its semi-annual regulatory agenda, suggesting perhaps that EPA has quietly abandoned this proposed SNR. There's nothing official, and it is certainly interested in reducing the role of this chemical in the marketplace. It would make sense that it wouldn't say anything about how it was backing off. But at this point, it seems unlikely that this SNR will become a final rule during the remainder of the Obama administration. Also early in the Obama administration, it looked at chlorinated paraffins, which are primarily used in metalworking fluids, but they also have value as flame retardants in some applications. Again, a chemical action plan late in December. A final significant new use rule came out about a year and a half ago, for short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which have disappeared from the market. And there's a final SNR for very long-chain chlorinated paraffins. For both mid-chain and long-chain chlorinated paraffins, EPA, through some enforcement actions, convinced manufacturers of these products to file pre-manufactured notices, or PMNs, so they could review them and evaluate them and potentially regulate them. as part of that regulatory process, it's issued some draft risk assessments. In December, it asked for comments. Comment deadline was in February. EPA has indicated that it would like to phase out and ban ongoing use of these chemicals due primarily to environmental considerations. There is industry pushback on that, however. HBCD is another flame retardant, which Kristen mentioned. It had a chemical action plan, and that was followed up with a final significant new use rule last year. The results of these rules is that it is difficult to import products containing them and to get the chemical to use in putting the chemical into articles, such as textiles. Since EPA adopted the chemical action plan approach to regulating chemicals of concern, which came at the early in the administration, starting in 2012, EPA migrated to something that it calls the TSCA Work Plan, which in my view has been really a pilot project for TSCA reform legislation. Under the original TSCA Work Plan, EPA developed a prioritization criteria, and using that criteria, it identified 83 chemicals for further assessment, including antimony trioxide, long-chain and medium-chain chlorinated paraffin, and among the earliest chemicals to be reviewed, as well as TBPH, TBP, TCEP, and TBP. As Kristen mentioned, EPA has completed one risk assessment. That's for antimony trioxide, looking at environmental effects. And even though ATO scored fairly high in Kristen's slide, EPA concluded that it did not have concerns, and it plans to take no further regulatory action with respect to that flame retardant synergist. After 2 years, EPA updated its TSCA Work Plan, removing some chemicals, including a flame retardant, and adding 23 others. The changes focused particularly on flame retardants, adding both the DECA, BDE, and HBCD that had been the subject of chemical action plans, as well as a list of additional flame retardants such as TBB, PA, TPP, and ITTP. In January of last year, so a year and a half ago now, EPA announced that the chlorinated paraffins, mid chain and long chain, would be addressed as new chemicals and would not be addressed under the TSCA Work Plan. This gives EPA greater flexibility because the standards for regulating PMNs is significantly, and new chemicals generally, is significantly lower than under the TSCA Work Plan, which calls for a finding of whether a chemical will present an unreasonable risk. In August, so just under a year ago, EPA released problem formulations for 4 clusters of flame retardants, and for 3 of them, it had also issued initial assessments saying we think we've got concerns in this area, this area, this area. Chlorinated phosphate esters, cyclic aliphatic bromides, and tetrabromobisphenol A. And there are a number of chemicals under each of those clusters. EPA felt it needed more data in order to fully define what its initial assessment was for brominated phthalates. Suffice it to say, however, that EPA has these chemicals in its sights, and it plans to address them thoroughly. Which brings us to TSCA reform. TSCA reform is legislation to update the now 40-year-old Toxic Substances Control Act, which hasn't been significantly amended in those 40 years and which is getting pretty creaky. Compromised bipartisan legislation called the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act has been working its way through Congress for several years. It passed the House of Representatives in May, it passed the Senate in June, and it's now on the President's desk awaiting signature. And I understand that the President is going to sign the legislation in a ceremony tomorrow. So starting tomorrow, we will have a new TSCA. The primary provision of the statute, as amended, will be to give EPA more authority to regulate hazardous chemicals. It will direct EPA to set priorities, then to conduct risk evaluations of high priority chemicals, and those found to present an unreasonable risk to regulate those chemicals. And it removes a number of barriers that EPA has faced to regulate chemicals under Section 6. In particular, the legislation directs EPA to designate TSCA work plan chemicals as high priority chemicals, and 10 TSCA work plan chemicals must be selected as high priority chemicals within the first 6 months. So in other words, by December. So which ones? Well, EPA has already been working on DECA-BDE, HBCD, chlorinated paraffins, and the 4 flame retardant clusters. So it's likely that flame retardants are going to be among, perhaps the only, chemicals that EPA starts out addressing under the TSCA work plan. Once the EPA conducts a risk evaluation for a high priority chemical, such as these flame retardants, it then makes a decision as to whether they present an unreasonable risk to health or the environment under the conditions of use without regard to cost or other non-risk factors, or whether they don't. And if they don't, then it stops, and if they do, then it proceeds to adopt restrictions for them. And there are timelines that EPA must meet at each stage of the process. There's also a much debated, controversial provision on preemption, since states, as we'll discuss, have shown a lot of interest in flame retardants. While EPA is conducting its risk assessment, and after it has defined the scope of the risk evaluation, there is something called the high priority pause, that's the informal name for it. So it's while EPA is thinking about it, preemption, that will preempt any new state restrictions on that chemical within the scope of the risk evaluation. Once EPA makes a decision that a chemical does not present an unreasonable risk, then there would be preemption of both existing state restrictions for that chemical within that scope, as well as any new ones that might come along later. If EPA finds that a chemical does present an unreasonable risk, then preemption would not kick in until EPA promulgated risk management requirements. There are also testing obligations in this bill. It authorizes EPA to require testing done by order. So manufacturers can expect to be ordered to do testing. And new chemicals are going to face greater scrutiny as EPA for the first time has to articulate a conclusion based on its review. So getting started within the first 6 months, EPA has to ensure that 10 TSCA work plan chemicals are underway. It has to report to Congress, and it has to set up an advisory committee. Within a year, it has to establish a risk-based screening process, and in the meantime, continue what it's been doing under the TSCA work plan, and establish a process for EPA to conduct risk evaluations, and in the meantime, continue what it's been doing, and develop guidance and get set on a number of other provisions. So that is what's been going on under the Toxic Substances Control Act. But of course, that's not the only federal agency interested in flame retardants. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has regulations not so much on flame retardants in particular, but rather on flammability of finished products, such as those made with textiles. most notably, beginning in 2000, a relatively recent change came in 2006, where CPSC amended its standard for flammability of mattresses and mattress pads. In the course of that rulemaking, it addressed concerns that had been raised about the use of flame retardants. And its point was that the flammability standards can be met by any method that manufacturers can come up with, through the use of flame retardants or anything else, barriers, etc. And it added the staff of the Consumer Product Safety Commission is working with EPA to develop a significant use rule for chemicals that could be used to meet these flammability requirements. And by that, I believe they were thinking about DECA-BDE. I could be wrong. Then 2 years later, EPA proposed a flammability standard for residential upholstered furniture. Still not final. The preamble to that rulemaking continued to express concern about the use of flame retardants to meet flammability standards. And CPSC said it would monitor progress. It's been relatively less involved in recent years. This rulemaking, which was proposed in 2008, is not scheduled to be become a final rule, if it does, until over a year from now. So it'll be a 9-year rulemaking process. Recently, however, the Commission's attention was drawn by a rulemaking petition filed by a number of NGOs seeking to declare that household consumer products containing organohalogen, whether it be chlorine-based or bromine-based flame retardants, are banned consumer products under the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. Quite a bold move. The CPSC has not agreed to grant the petition and conduct rulemaking. What it has done is to make the petition itself available for comment, and it held a hearing, and there were commenters and there were witnesses at the hearing who provided additional information. The CPSC has scheduled a briefing of the commissioners on whether to proceed to rulemaking in September of this year. So we'll see whether anything happens. Now, as the CPSC has considered its flammability standards, it has acknowledged that California actually, in effect, sets the national standard for flammability through its Technical Bulletin 117. TB 117 has been around for a lot of years. It was revised for the first time in many years in 2013. The TB 117 had been used as a reason why manufacturers felt the need to use flame retardants, or because they had to meet flame retardants in order to meet TB 117. TB 117 never did require specifically the use of flame retardants, and certainly not the use of particular flame retardants. It's been revised, and it's expected that there will be less pressure on manufacturers to use flame retardants to meet its flammability criteria. It consists primarily of a technical test method on how to evaluate the ignition resistance of certain representative products. The bottom line, though, is that it is expected to reduce the use of flame retardants over time. In addition to TB 117, which is not specific to flame retardants, obviously, a number of states have adopted restrictions on particular flame retardants. California, Oregon, and Washington have all regulated PBDEs, and California and Washington have also pending legislation to address additional flame retardants, and so forth. So you can see that the left coast and the west and the right coast and the Midwest have been the states that have been primarily interested in addressing flame retardants, it is likely that we will see some new legislation become final this legislative session. Whether it will in fact become final or not is unclear, of course. So what does it mean for you? Well, obviously, if you use flame retardants or are considering the use of flame retardants, it is always smart to evaluate to what extent you need to use flame retardants. With revised TB 117, there may be less need to use flame retardants, or there may be the capability of using smaller quantities. In addition to yes, no, and quantities, there's obviously which one. The EPA information, and as well as the EU information that Kristen mentioned, is quite helpful in helping manufacturers select flame retardants based on their environmental and health aspects. What those evaluations do not address, however, is the utility of those flame retardants in particular applications. And it's the utility which needs to be an important consideration. Flame retardant restrictions are under consideration at the state level and at EPA and internationally. It makes sense to monitor these regulatory developments. And if the use of particular flame retardants is particularly important for your products, it can be very helpful for your company or your trade association to engage in advocacy, to try and head off new restrictions or to create some exemptions within those restrictions, etc. And then finally, of course, there's the whole issue of compliance. Proposition 65 has a number of flame retardants on it. State restrictions, EPA will increasingly have its own restrictions, and many of these restrictions are likely to apply, some of them already do apply, to chemicals in articles. And so, to the extent you import textiles or textile products, it is incumbent upon you to know what your supply chain is putting into your products. How you find that out is your problem. EPA in December of 2014 issued a final significant new use rule for benzidine-based chemicals, in which it said, for many reasons, companies are having to find out what their upstream suppliers are putting into their products. California Green Chemistry, Washington State Green Chemistry, conflict minerals, etc., are creating the increased need for supply chain communications, particularly from suppliers to downstream processors to end users, as to the chemical composition of products. Information which is not normally disclosed on material safety data sheets or technical data sheets. And so you as a company need to consider joining with many other companies in grappling with supply chain communications. It's not easy, but it is likely to be a future trend. At this point, I'm going to stop and take your questions.
All right, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kristen, for that. Before we jump into some of these questions that have been coming in, I just want to tell everyone that the recording of today's webinar will be sent out to all registered participants. If you'd like the slides, then I would encourage you to send an email to one of our two speakers today. Alternatively, you can also send an email to me or to John Curry at IFAI, and we can help you out with that.
Yeah.
If you're interested,
I'd be glad to send out slides.
Okay, right. If you're interested in the slides or recording of any of the previous webinars in the series, you can please send an email to John at IFAI, and he can assist you with that as well. So let's jump in and answer some of these questions. One of the questions has to do with the flame retardant chemicals that were discussed. And the question is, and I'm not sure whether this is really better for Kristen or for Mark, so both of you jump in. Do all newly purchased furniture contain flame retardants?
I'd say the answer is probably not all. For instance, I wouldn't think a metal chair would have flame retardant. The newly purchased chairs probably were designed to comply with California Technical Bulletin 117, which sets a performance standard. It allows the use of flame retardants or barriers or inherently flame-resistant materials to meet the flammability requirement. So it really depends upon the composition and what the manufacturer or the part manufacturer chose to use.
Okay, sort of from the same audience member. How can I get my furniture tested for flame retardants?
There are entities that will do that testing for you. I believe Heather Stapleton at Duke University would be happy to accept a sample and test it for you. I don't know what the costs involved with that are.
Yeah, I think there are a number of third-party laboratories that can do that kind of testing.
You can also contact your supplier and ask them.
Right. And are flame what are flame retardants used in the home other than furniture foam, and I guess furniture upholstery?
They're certainly used in fabrics on furniture, sofa cushions, the exterior of the sofa cushion as well as the foam. They're used in curtains. They're used in home electronics.
They may also be used in carpets and the material underneath, the foam underneath the carpet as well.
Yeah, no, they're used pretty heavily in spray polyurethane foam insulation as well.
Yes.
And I think this is a question for you, Kristen, because you talked about how one of the ways that flame retardants move around is by absorbing onto dust. Could flame retardant chemicals in laundry effluent absorb onto the microfibers or fiber dust that's also present in the same effluent?
Yes. So flame retardants that like to absorb onto particles will absorb in your wastewater, and as they move through the wastewater treatment process, they will absorb to any other particles that they can find. Those are typically removed as biosolids from the wastewater treatment process.
And Kristen, you talked about photodegradation of flame retardants. I think in particular you mentioned that the carbon halogen bond is particularly susceptible to cleavage. If that's true, if the flame retardants in cushions and in fabrics or upholstery and lawn furniture, is that going to be degraded by the sun?
If they're outside, they could be. If they're inside, I think that's less likely because it's a process that is mediated by ultraviolet light, which doesn't get indoors very well. But if outside, possibly. But it's the rates at which it occurred depend on the flame retardant itself, matrix, and some other chemistry as well.
Okay. Here's a question related to TIB's 117. So the revision to TIB 117 has not completely eliminated the use of flame retardants in furniture. Is this true, Mark?
That's my understanding. Yes.
Okay. Here's a flame retardant question related to flame retardants related to tents. As flame retardant is currently a requirement in Canada, how long would it take to reverse this law if it was found harmful? I'm not sure how to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that one. Political process.
Right.
Yeah. So minimum of 2 years. How's that?
Yeah, I think that's somehow related to your comments about advocacy, Mark.
Yeah.
How about zinc borate? Is zinc borate pretty safe from scrutiny at the moment?
Zinc borate, going back to the slides, it has neurological toxicity, aquatic toxicity, and environmental persistence. It has a number of high ratings, so it may undergo some scrutiny. I don't know that there's a lot at the moment, but potentially in the future.
Mark, have you seen anything?
I have not seen regulatory focus on zinc borate.
Okay. And I have a question for Kristen. Again, sort of going back to the photodegradation and the biopersistence you talked about at the beginning of your presentation. The flame retardant chemicals that are showing up in the polar regions, are those the whole molecules themselves, or are they fragments of these flame retardant molecules? And how do you reconcile the fact that they're susceptible to photodegradation by UV exposure with the fact that they can migrate all the way to the polar regions?
So there are two questions there. So the whole compound is detected in polar bears. There may also be breakdown products or transformation products or degradation products in the polar bears as well. I believe I've seen some of those. Well, it's a matter of rate. So with respect to the transport and the photodegradation, it depends on how quickly each one occurs. If you get to the Arctic more quickly than you photodegrade, then you've already gotten there. But also, so maybe you photodegraded part of the compounds on the way in this long-range transport, but not all of them. So I should mention the concentrations that we do detect them are very small, but we do detect them.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have coming in now. We've reached the top of the hour. If anyone has any additional questions, I'm sure the speakers would be very happy for you to reach out to them directly. Their emails are on the slide that you're looking at now. And as I said before, you'll be getting, everyone will be getting the recordings sent to them. And if you'd like the slides, reach out to the speakers. If you'd like any of the information from any of the previous webinars, you can reach out to John Curry at the Industrial Fabrics Association. He can help you with that. We got one more question that looks like it just came in, so we'll deal with this one. Has there been any link between high levels, so flame retardants in human blood and cancer?
That really depends on the particular flame retardant. Some flame retardants are suspected to be carcinogens, some are not. But with respect to for those that are carcinogenic, I don't know for sure the answer, but one would have to review the level that is required to become carcinogen or to have cancer effects versus the concentration that's in blood.
Okay.
So you'd have to really investigate a little more closely which compound in particular.
Right. Okay. I'd like to thank Kristen and thank Mark, and thank everyone for tuning in, and hope to see everyone in Charlotte in October.
Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.